Real quick, guys, I have to talk to you about Clive Barker. From Hellraiser to his fantasy works like The Great and Secret Show, as well as Weeworld, Clive Barker has completely warped not only my sense of fantasy, but also affected modern works like Mandy. I have to talk to you not only about his career, the love I have for the Cenobites, but also his failed attempts at Hellraiser's Pinhead versus Lord of Illusion's Harry D'Amour in the Scarlet Gospels. I mean, damn, this is going to be one wild ride. Before I forget, this conversation is going to include graphic horror imagery as well as discussion of sexual content. Seriously, folks, this is some dark and twisted stuff. Also, spoilers for the following. Hellraiser, Hellbound Hellraiser 2, Hellraiser Revelations, The Great and Secret Show, Lord of Illusions, and the Scarlet Gospels. You've been warned. With all that being said, let me also thank my patrons. We've got Chris Markinson, Stormy OK, and Jeff Strait. Thank you so much for taking care of me, guys. Now, this is my little excursion into all the madness that is Clive Barker. And this is Dubious Consumption. So here's the thing. I love horror. If it hasn't been clear over the first year of this channel's output, it's ingrained in my psyche. But to be honest, I don't remember much of my childhood, thanks to a bit of trauma induced by a bully. These lovely fingers were flattened by a metal door at the age 7, and I ripped them out. And bam, my life changed. With that kind of hanging over my head, I don't even really remember the first horror movies that I experienced. It may have been Jurassic Park, but all the more likely it was Arachnophobia. My half-sister was having a sleepover with a neighbor, but that was the first horror film that imprinted itself on me, and until recently, I was still deathly afraid of spiders. The thing that got me into reading was R.L. Stine's Goosebumps. This transitioned into Dean Koontz, which for some reason my parents thought was a more sanitized version than Stephen King. They were wrong. Then they got into John Saul, which makes children evil. And finally, in my teens, I was able to get a hold of Stephen King's books. I laid this all out just to explain why Barker captures my imagination. He doesn't quite play by the rules the rest of the genre has fallen into, where with Koontz you had weird psychological damage as a catalyst. Saul, all you ever had was the present children are creepy vibe. King, well, there's a drinking game surrounding his output for a reason. Barker started out with the Books of Blood, an anthology collection of stories that pushed the envelope, not only in the subject matter, but also by breaking the idea that these short stories needed to actually stick together with a consistent theme or tone. Several of these have spun off into their own movies, successful or not, but I'm sure you'll recognize at least a handful of these titles. Rawhead Rex, Midnight Meat Train, Quicksilver Highway, Lord of Illusions, Book of Blood, Candyman, Dread. No, not that one. That's the one. One of the things that set him apart was his injecting fantasy into his horror. Most of the time, the more mundane the story, the more crippling horror that completely shreds his characters. When he does delve into fantasy, he's able to infuse these over-the-top ideas and pull them off with an elegance you couldn't have imagined otherwise. My favorite book of his is The Great and Secret Show, the first book of the art in the as-yet unfinished series. It's an interesting amalgamation of real-world locations, the excess of Beverly Hills, time loops, and a Romeo and Juliet storyline between two self-made gods of hope and fear. What's so interesting about this story is that it deals with evolution and how to subvert our limitations through a combination of science and magic. In doing so, Jaffe and Fletcher are able to pull creatures from the minds of their victims, resulting in immense creations of horror and dreams, respectively. There are many storylines playing out at once, culminating in a giant battle between these two forces, as well as introducing entirely foreign lands in the form of quiddity. This is also the first novel-sized appearance of Harry D'Amour, of Lord of Illusions fame. More on him later. They even made a comic book adaptation of it that managed to capture the insanely dense book. Check it out if you can find it. I'm not even sure if I still own it. Although named as the future of horror for his short story collections, most of us were introduced to Clive's unique vision through 1987's Hellraiser, based on his novella, The Hellbound Heart. Interestingly enough, I found out while researching this that he wrote the novella after the script as a way of drumming up investors for his unproduced script. Written and directed by the master of horror himself, this is where we're first introduced to the Cenobites, priests of the Order of the Gash. These otherworldly creatures are garbed in BDSM gear with mutilations that are steeped in perversity and sexual exploitation. As they put it, pain and pleasure indivisible. One of the interesting things in comparing the Hellbound Heart to its film counterpart is that the latter's poster boy, Pinhead, is a completely different beast in its written form. The Hell Priest, as he'd later be known, was actually a secondary female Cenobite that was just another one of the mystical creatures summoned by the Lament configuration. In the adaptation, she got transferred into the male lead Cenobite, played by Doug Bradley, and took on the moniker Pinhead. Obviously, those are nails driven into his flesh, but without a name, the fans chose one for him. In the decades since, we've been treated to multiple interpretations of the character, through the many movies, books, and comics. With over 100 issues in print, the comics don't stick to the established timelines of the film, instead blazing their own path. As such, there's not an established continuity for the character, or the Order of the Gash. For my part, it's hard to separate the multiple aspects of this universe, especially when they conflict. My favorite of the Hellraiser series is Hellbound Hellraiser 2. This one goes a long way in setting the tone of the series, along with showing us the Hell Dimension and their god Leviathan. This film demonstrates my favorite attributes of the Cenobites, but in particular, Pinhead's bureaucratic nature. In one scene, Dr. Chenard uses a traumatized girl to open the Lament configuration, hoping to be able to observe the Cenobites and their methods. However, before the Cenobites can converge on the girl, Pinhead steps in, stating,
"No, it is not hands that call us. It is desire."
While the other Cenobites are more of a bloodthirsty lot, Pinhead is able to rein them in and focus their attention on the person who actually called them. Hellbound allows us to see the Cenobitic form of hell in all its demented glory, revealing a grimy labyrinthine structure that accommodates all the individual manifestations of torture. It's a unique vision that is so separated from our past and current interpretations of hell that you can't help but be drawn into these dank hallways that seem to stretch on forever, and yet there's this giant lighthouse-style octahedron in the skies above that can immediately pierce to your deepest, darkest secrets. There are so many layers to this depiction that it's almost impossible to extract them. My main issues with the film arise in the back half, where Dr. Chenard and Julia explore hell. The good doctor is transformed by Leviathan into something. While his body is utterly mutilated in a similar fashion to the other Cenobites, his mutilations seem to be different, instead focused on actively culling them after his inception. It's not really explained what the difference is between them, but we do see that once he's ascended, he does a lot more to spread the use of the puzzle boxes than we'd ever seen before. While the first half of the film builds up the way the Cenobites function, making them more into these monks, the antithesis of the 80s gleeful killers, it also dashes a large part of what made them so fascinating. In exploring the Cenobites' origins, it turns them from these extra-dimensional priests into humans that were altered due to their vices. It's still an interesting idea, but it makes more sense for the lackeys we see in later films, such as the off-brand Cenobites created in Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, or the Silent Hill-type creatures of Hellseeker, not the godlike summoner of chains that we see with Pinhead. Still, we learn of Pinhead's origins as Elliot Spencer, a captain in the British Expeditionary Force who finds the Lament configuration in 1921. However, according to Doug Bradley, the eponymous Pinhead, both Clive Barker and him had decided early on that Pinhead was formerly human. A line from one of Clive's plays swam into my mind: "I am in mourning for my humanity." At this point, there was no backstory for the character, but I had discussed this with Clive, and we had agreed that he had once been human. But whether this was yesterday, last week, last year, 10, 100, 1,000 years, I didn't know. I didn't need to. Sufficient to have that idea lodged into my brain, a perpetual unconscious grieving for the man he had once been, for a life and a face he couldn't even remember, and a frozen grief. I felt now that Pinhead existed in an emotional limbo where neither pain nor pleasure could touch him. A pretty good definition of hell for me. And with that, it's hard to argue that this wasn't at least a fraction of the idea they were looking for. It is interesting, however, that in his 1987 novel Weave World, that the surgeons are depicted as demons from a long-lost world who commit unspeakable acts of body mutilation on their victims. One such target had his bones removed, only to be brought back as a boneless demon. The surgeons are never explicitly called the Cenobites, but it's obvious who they're meant to be. Despite this contradiction between Bradley and Clive's intentions, Pinhead's disparity between his human and demon forms become the backbone of Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth, arguably the last good film in the series. There, they made him more of a god-mocking demon than a sexually perverse bureaucrat.
am the way.
And from here on, Pinhead continued to devolve from a fetishized priest with a purpose to an imagined slasher-style serial killer in the tripped-out scenes of the 8th film, Hellworld. By the time the last film rolled around, Doug Bradley had been dropped, or more accurately, offered the gig for the price of a new fridge on a first draft script. As much as I dislike this movie, it does have one decidedly Pinhead line.
Now there is a deficit of flesh. Debt is outstanding, and we seek payment.
I'm, of course, talking about Hellraiser Revelations. The writer of this story, Gary Jane Tunnicliffe, claims that he wasn't happy with what happened to his script, so he was given the reins to write and direct the most recent Hellraiser Judgment. It was filmed in 2016 here in and around Oklahoma City. I'm sad to say that I missed my chance to be an extra in a Hellraiser movie, but that's on me. So before I get into my thoughts on Hellraiser Judgment, I'd like to take a deeper look into Hellpriest's only novel and second literary excursion, the Scarlet Gospels. But wait, there's one more key component to the Scarlet Gospels that I haven't touched. While the Hellpriest journey is the heart of the book, there's a protagonist that Barker's fans are intimately familiar with, and his inclusion added another level of excitement that just wouldn't have been there before. Harry D'Amour. As always, you can find me at justindherd.net. We're always open to change, so if you have any ideas or comments, please tweet them at justindherd. Patreon is the best way to support your smaller creators. There are a variety of rewards ranging from getting your name in every video to being able to dictate our future content. Even $1 pledge per video can completely turn our lives around. Each dollar goes to improving the channel and buying better equipment. We recently used what we got so far to pay for a new mic setup, which is what you're hearing now. In the past, it's gone to a new lighting setup, a green screen, and cameras to help us bring you this updated version of Dubious Consumption. Also, we're on TeePublic right now. Go pick up our shirts, get them as banners, pillows, coffee mugs, notebooks. Notebooks, that's where it's at. Anyway, be sure to set fire to the hive by mashing the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Make sure to hit that bell and spread the word. A hardened, noir-style detective with occult ties, Harry is loved by Barker's fanbase second only to Pinhead. Now, I love Harry D'Amour as much as any Barker fan, even if my introduction to him was Scott Bakula's sublime performance. If I'm going to be honest, there's nothing really that interesting about Harry. First and foremost, he's a good detective, but his function in most stories is to move the plot forward. I don't think I'd call him underdeveloped. He feels like he's a part of these worlds as much as anyone could be, however his antics just don't stick. He's not instrumental to the plot, he's just an agent of change. He's appeared in several short stories, then a cameo on The Gray and Secret Show, only to become a main character in Everville. However, most people know him from his adaptation of Barker's Book of Blood story, The Last Illusion, or as the movie became known, Lord of Illusions. In this 1999 film, Scott Bakula plays the occult detective in a bedraggled performance that would be echoed in the Constantine years later. He gets pulled into a plot involving the line between illusion and magic, fanatics, and a cult leader resurrected after being dead for over a decade. This was Clive Barker's last directorial effort. The director's cut is the definitive version, built from the ground up after his horrible experience with Nightbreed. He had the score made distinctly for the director's cut, and honestly, there are only a few differences, but they're crucial to help build the world. While this story has no real connection to Barker's widely known Cenobites, it does have similar body horror and mutilation through the cult leader Nyx, otherwise known as the Puritan. The story revolves around Swan, a David Copperfield-style magician whose show goes wrong and he dies in front of everyone. D'Amour is brought in through another case, accidentally witnessing the murder and torture of one of the men who originally killed the Puritan. Through investigating the local magic society, as well as hunting down Swan's cohorts who took Nixon out more than a decade before, Harry is able to find Swan still alive and ends up confronting the long-dead leader on the night of his resurrection. Here, we get these secret societies being more farce than anything else. Nyx the Puritan is the closest thing to truth, revealing or perhaps corrupting his victims' minds, showing them that everyone is nothing more than mud and shit. After destroying the approximation of a god, D'Amour gets the girl for a time. Similar to John Constantine, he's beaten down through his regular interactions with demons, has tattoos over his body that are protective seals, and there is a much more sexual element in Barker's universe. I mean, what? The visionary behind the BDSM demon Cenobites goes over the top with wildly out-of-place sexuality? I know, right? Shocking. Early on, as part of establishing D'Amour in the Scarlet Gospels, we flash back to his time as a detective and see the loss of his corrupt partner, Scummy. Quite a name. Let's just say that it involves Scummy being burned to death while a demon masturbates next to Harry while forcing him to watch his partner die. Let me just ask you a simple question here. Spit or blood? But if you've gotten this far and didn't expect some dark, twisted sexual imagery from Barker, I just don't know what to say. Anyway, D'Amour's chosen to be the prophet of Pinhead's Scarlet Gospels. Rather than fighting him, he ends up following Pinhead's trek through hell as Pinhead destroys it, so he can rebuild it in his image. That damned hell priest. Now that we've established the major players in the Scarlet Gospels, we're ready to jump in, and we can do that in our next video. This is the first of many videos on Clive Barker. Next up, our deep dive into the Scarlet Gospels. I'd love to hear your opinions on the Cenobites and Harry D'Amour. Which do you like better? Thanks for all you do. My name is Justin D. Hurd. This has been Dubious Consumption, and I'm outro.